Hey kids, how you doing? Um, Now, by this time, we have reached kind of in the midpoint of the war. The United States has just gotten involved. We've concentrated mostly on the United States entering the war in the Pacific. That's where it started, and then as we've been watching, Band of Brothers, and we take a look at the invasion of North Africa, where the U.S. actually first sees action against the Germans. We'll be getting into that. We're kind of right in this 1942, 1943 period of the war, and this is where the war really turns against Germany. They're at the biggest point that they ever get, right around that summer of 1942. But the seeds of their defeat were already planted. They didn't realize it at the time, but that's kind of the case. And where that really starts to turn, where it becomes kind of obvious to everybody that things aren't going well, is almost out in Asia, where Germany loses a battle called Stalingrad, city named after Joseph Stalin, and that's really the turning point of World War II. There were other battles that you could look at that all kind of happened somewhat around that same time, but for Germany, this was it. They really couldn't win the war. Now they kept fighting, but especially looking at it now, um, we can see that after Stalingrad, the Germans had no chance to win the war, because unlike the Soviet Union, they couldn't give up hundreds of thousands of men uh, in a single battle and expect to be able to recover from that. That just wasn't something that any country other than the Soviet Union or maybe China could get away with. So let's take a look here at the Battle of Stalingrad, and follow along here while I read, okay? World War II, Stalingrad, not another step backward, Nazi weather. When the ice finally melted in the Soviet Union in the spring of 1942, German forces were still deep inside Russia and poised to end the war on the Eastern Front. True, the Soviets and the frigid weather stopped the German blitzkrieg in the winter of 1941 and 42, but they were still just outside Moscow, Leningrad, and controlled much of the Soviet Ukraine in the south. The German army was not quite what it was a year earlier, though. In 1941, the Germans attacked in three directions trying to conquer the Soviet Union. In 1942, while they were ready to attack, they had to choose one of three directions and focus their energies in one spot. Hitler reasoned that the area of the southern Soviet Union was the most important, since it contained much of the food and oil needed by both sides to continue the war. Hitler set his sights on a summer offensive in southern Russia designed to reach the plains of Asia. Stalin's city. The German offensive knifed through the Soviet defenders just as it had a year earlier. When the Soviets were comfortable fighting in the frigid cold of the Russian winter, it was obvious that the Germans were the masters of the summer heat. German tanks crushed Soviet resistance everywhere and pushed the Red Army back to the banks of the Volga River, one of the largest rivers in Russia. The Soviets retreated into the city of Stalingrad, named for their leader, Joseph Stalin. Stalingrad represented the last hope for the Soviets to stop the Germans from crossing the Volga and storming into Asia. The Red Army once again surrendered thousands of square miles of territory, but their strategy of trading space for time was about finished. In response to the retreats and surrenders, Stalin issued an order to his army. They were not to take another step backward. They were to fight, and if necessary, to die in the city of Stalingrad. Under no circumstances were the Germans to get over the Volga River. The NKVD, the Soviet Union's dreaded secret police, set up machine guns behind every Soviet unit. If a Red Army soldier if any Red Army soldiers attempted to turn around and retreat for any reason, they were immediately executed by their own officers in the NKVD. Often, a Red Army soldier's choice boiled down to a German bullet or a Russian one. The executions had their intended effect. The Red Army stood and fought, turning Stalingrad into a fortress that they refused to leave. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, reduced the city to rubble. Stuka dive bombers strafed Soviet troops coming over the river to fortify Stalingrad. The Red Army went underground. The War of the Rats. By August of 1942, the Germans controlled all of Stalingrad except for two huge factory complexes. Well, They controlled almost everything above ground. Under the city was the domain of the Red Army. Soviet soldiers knocked out basement walls so they could move from house to house without ever going into the light. From there, they tried to kill Germans one at a time and bleed the German army to death in the ruins. And there you can see a picture of Red Army soldiers. They've knocked out the walls under, so they're going from basement to basement without ever having to go actually above ground. Day after day, thousands of Germans and Soviets clashed in the houses and streets of the city named for Stalin. Through the fall of 1942, the Germans were convinced that they were only weeks away from conquering the city. In fact, Adolf Hitler even announced to the Nazi Party Congress that the city was theirs, except for a few trouble spots. The Soviets fought on, throwing themselves into battle, sometimes even without weapons. The sight of thousands of Red Army soldiers running into machine gun fire, crawling over the bodies of those who fell before them, became first a familiar and then a scary sight to German troops. No matter how many Soviets died, there were always more to replace them. The Germans controlled almost everything in Stalingrad, and yet not all of it. Then it started to snow. The nightmare of another winter in Russia started to become real to the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. In December 1942, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and thousands of tanks swept around the city, eventually surrounded the Germans. In the blink of an eye, the German army went from being days away from winning the war to being surrounded. The Witch's Cauldron. German commanders realized they were now surrounded over 1,000 miles away from German territory. They asked Hitler if they could fight their way back to friendly territory and try to take Stalingrad again later in the next year. Hitler absolutely refused. For him, the idea of leaving Stalingrad was unthinkable. He would not let his hated enemy have that triumph. Instead, he told the commanders that the Luftwaffe would resupply the German army through the winter. The commanders knew that the Luftwaffe could never deliver enough supplies to keep 250,000 Germans surrounded in the city, fed, clothed, and fighting for even a few weeks, much less months. Still, Hitler refused to let them fight out. Even though they were starving and frostbitten, the Germans fought on, knowing their chance to see home again was slipping away. They knew that even if they survived Red Army bullets, that they would likely disappear into a Soviet prison camp somewhere in the frozen wastes of Russia. Almost nobody came home from that. Finally, when the food and ammunition had completely run out in February 1943, 200,000 men of the German Sixth Army surrendered. The defeat was a disaster for Germany. The Soviet army could afford to lose hundreds of thousands of men in a single battle, which they did. The Germans could not. From that point forward, the Red Army began pushing the German army backward for the next 2+ years until Soviet forces eventually captured the German capital city of Berlin in May 1945. Stalingrad was the turning point of World War II. Okay? So that's, as it says in the last thing, that's the turning point. From this point forward, the Germans don't go forward very much anymore. The Japanese have already been turned around. So even though they're at their absolute peak of the amount of territory that they control, it's never going to get any bigger than this, and it's only going to shrink. And 2 years later is when that territory is reduced down to nothing in the end of the war. So that's what we'll be studying from here on out. Okay, I'll see you then.